What's going on, everybody? This is James Grandmaster Facts Boyce. You are here for another episode of the Facts Project. Today, a very special guest. We get to talk with David F. Walker. If you do not know who this man, he, of course, is the author of this very book behind me, Bitterroot, The Next Movement. He's also done Shaft for Dynamite Comics, the Black Panther Party graphic novel. Thank you for being here, for one.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. We talked about it a little bit ago, but funny fact, of course, I had to reach out through this man's comments in order for us to build this interview up. And for one, sometimes you just got to take that shot. So that absolutely worked, and here we are.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sort of thing works more. It seems like it works more and more these days, right? Because
Right.
so the thing you have to remember to do is check your DMs, check the comments, all that sort of stuff. So,
Of
you know,
course.
it's all good and just trying to, as you're trying to get publicity for whatever it is you're working on, you gotta be ever vigilant.
Definitely. But the main topic for today is we're talking about this Kickstarter project that you started, a 96-page graphic novel called The Death of Bobby Hart.
Yep.
And loosely based, inspired by true events. And if of course you can honestly give up the reveal of exactly who this is loosely based on.
Yeah, it's loosely based on Donald Goines, who, for anyone who's listening, doesn't know who Donald Goines is. I don't want to get into that like mansplaining sort of thing, but a lot of people don't know who Donald Goines was, I should say. But he
I
was
think
a
it's right to do so for you.
yeah, yeah, he was a writer who in the early '70s published a bunch of books for a publisher called Holloway House.
Mhm.
Holloway House specialized in at the time what they called Black experience novels, and their two biggest selling authors were Iceberg Slim, who famously wrote Pimp, Trick Baby, Airtight Willie and Me. He was sort of Iceberg Slim was sort of like the king of street fiction, street lit, right?
Right.
Um, but then there was Donald Goines, and Donald Goines was more prolific than Iceberg Slim, and was more raw and grittier than Iceberg Slim was, which is saying a lot,
Yeah.
because Iceberg Slim, I mean, Pimp is like the how-to guide, right?
Hmm.
But I became obsessed with Donald Goines pretty young, probably younger than I should have been when I, discovered his books. But he was murdered in 1974, 75, somewhere in there, and
Hmm.
to this day, it hasn't been solved. The murder of him and his wife, whose name is Shirley Saylor. They were murdered in Detroit. Um, and I just kind of became obsessed with that story, wanted to tell that story. And then at some point realized, you know, I don't want to like not be able to solve the murder, right?
Hmm.
So I need to fictionalize it. I need to come up with a fictional character, and that's where Bobby Hart came from.
Yeah, and to reference some of this, the titles that kind of just jump out at you. I'm sure when people were purchasing these books, Whore's Son or
Yeah.
Dope Fiend or Daddy Cool, like these were particular titles that we like, man, I think I need to read that.
Yeah. I mean, Donald Goines had a book called Street of Hoes. I mean, he was out there and he was, very famously, he was a heroin addict. A lot of people believe that that was what his murder was surrounding his murder, the motivation for his murder. Um, and he wrote 16 novels in 4 years for Holloway House. So he was cranking them out really fast. And it's so much so that at one point they started publishing some of his books under a different name, Al C. Clark.
Yeah.
Um, and then after he died, then Holloway House was like, Al C. Clark, but really this is Donald Goines,
Right.
um, and so I just wanted to tell this story. I've been wanting to tell this story for a very long time. And then it evolved into something else. As once I made the decision that I wasn't going to do the Donald Goines story,
Hmm.
it gave me permission to do other things from a storytelling standpoint, from a narrative standpoint, and try to explore who this character Bobby Hart was. And then I had to come up with titles for the books he would have written. And I was
Hmm.
like, and Donald Goines had all the best titles for the most
Did.
part. Um, so I came up with like, Pimp Wars and Slaughter on the Stroll and then the Ghetto Avenger series and all that stuff. And the crazy thing is, I have people reaching out to me now. The Kickstarter's been going for almost a month now, and people are like, "Yo, how come I've never heard of this Bobby Hart guy?" And I'm like, because he's made up.
Right.
He's not a real person. These aren't real books. Um, and even the tagline for the book is um, a true crime story,
Hmm.
and like the word "true" has different meanings, right? Because it
Right.
can be true as in truthful, like this is nonfiction, or this is just a true crime, right?
Hmm.
And that's so it's a play on words.
Definitely. And even given the time frame in which you pretty much put this into perspective, how was it researching Donald as a man? Like you pretty much put into the context of the book where of course he's talking with like his publisher
Yeah,
and he wants an advance.
yeah.
And his publisher is basically letting him know, basically, if I give you an advance on this, it's all just gonna go up your arm. He's like, nah, man, I'm clean. So like,
Yeah.
so how did you research the man Donald of Donald Goines and made this interpretation into Bobby Hart?
So there's a couple books out there. There's a full biography called Low Road, which is about the life and death of Donald Goines. I can't remember who wrote that, but I read that one. Um, and then there's two books. One is called Street Players, and that's all about the history of Holloway House.
Okay.
And that's again, I'm terrible with names, so I can never remember who wrote what. Um, but that book, the Street Players book, was great because it was all about Holloway House. It was all about Donald Goines. It was all about Iceberg Slim. And there's uh, just a ton of information in there that most people don't know about Donald Goines. Most people in passing don't know. And so if you were to go on to and the book has an almost academic feel. I think it might have even been published by a
Yeah.
university press. Um, but then there was another book that came out called Sticking It to the Man, which is all about like pulp novels from primarily the 60s and 70s. And that's a collection of different essays, and like that book is just dope because it's got tons of information about Donald Goines, Iceberg Slim, tons of information about Holloway House, other Holloway House publishers like or publishers, authors like Roosevelt Mallory. So like, because I'm obsessed with all this stuff, I
Mhm.
started collecting all these books and to get sort of the inside dirt on some of these people because the vast majority of the books are out of print. Iceberg Slim and Donald Goines are the only two whose books are still in print. The others you got to really search to find them. But it's
Yeah.
kind of like, okay, who was Joe Nizel? Joe Nizel wrote something like 60 books for Holloway House. What was his story? And in Sticking It to the Man, it was I there's information about him. And so as I started doing this research and Holloway House and Donald Goines and all these other writers, but then I also started thinking about what it means to be
Hmm.
a black creator working for a publisher who specializes in stuff that is being sold to a black audience, but the owner of the company is white, and their motivations may be, suspect at best, right?
Yeah, because it almost gives you the context almost in relation to a Jerry Heller from Ruthless Records.
Yes, Jerry Heller is a great example of that, and there's some others too, who uh, whether it's Blaxploitation films,
Hmm.
hip hop, or even going back to like the 30s and 40s with the race movies that were made for a black audience,
Hmm.
but they were made and distributed by a lot of them were made and distributed by white companies, which is the thing that a lot of people don't realize, right? Like if you talk about race movies, people will talk about Oscar Micheaux, who was like the godfather of black cinema, but they're not talking about the Popkin brothers or Toddy Productions and all these other ones. So to a certain extent, I start getting into that, what it means to be a black creator who is being stuck telling a certain type of story. And if you want to do something different, people will say to you, nope, we don't want anything different, right?
Hmm.
And you can see it even today, right here, right now, like some of the stuff that's being written about Ryan Coogler's new movie Sinners, and
Yes,
it's like they're trying to put him back in the box, right?
exactly.
And so that's a lot of what this story is about. there's a point where I realized, oh, yo, this story is as much about me
Hmm.
as it is about Bobby Hart, right? It's about when you say, hey, I don't want to do this sort of stuff anymore. I want to do my own thing. And then your editors and your publishers are like, hey, no, we don't know if that'll sell. You
Yeah.
know, you can write Pimp Wars, but don't write, anything that's too positive. Let's
Right.
keep it stuck in that negativity.
Yeah, because I was thinking, why do you think that publishers actually like took a chance on somebody like Goines or better yet, anybody who was at Holloway House at that time?
So what happened was really Iceberg Slim's first book, Pimp, came out late 50s, I believe.
Hmm.
And it was just sort of like they were just throwing stuff at the wall to see what would stick at Holloway
Right.
House. And they were always releasing a lot of exploitation books, this pulp fiction stuff, but they never really catered to a black audience before. Pimp was one of the first books that they put out,
Yeah.
and and that book created an audience that wasn't clearly visible to anybody. And so this is late 60s actually, because I want to say Pimp came out like 67, something like that.
Hmm.
Um, and and Holloway House realized, oh, yo, this like there might be an audience for this. And
Hmm.
then right around that same time, Donald Goines, he's in prison. He's read Iceberg Slim's books, and he's like, yo, I could do this. So
Hmm.
he wrote two books. He submitted them to Holloway House while he was still in prison,
Right.
and they gave him a publishing deal. And then his books come out, and they were such a huge success that it's very similar to like what happened with Blaxploitation films. Like, there was a handful of movies that came out, they made a decent amount of money, and then suddenly everyone was scrambling to make these movies. And Holloway House realized, like, oh, black people read books, they read magazines, and so
Yeah.
they started publishing a magazine called Players, which was like they called the Black Playboy, right? And it was
Okay.
very similar to Playboy magazine. They had a lot of naked women in it, but there was also a ton of articles, a lot of short fiction. So like there might be a short story by James Baldwin or stuff by
Hmm.
Chester Himes. And so they were leaning into this, sort of this black literary scene. At the same time, they were sort of shaping it, and they were building what would be now they call it street fiction,
Street
right?
literature. Yep.
Yeah. And so that was it. Like between Iceberg Slim and Donald Goines, those two writers, Holloway House realized that there was an untapped market. And then they brought in, guys like Joseph Nazel and Odie Hawkins, Roosevelt Mallory. There's a whole bunch of them. And the crazy thing is most of them were black writers, right?
Mhm.
But there's a couple that were white dudes writing as black folk,
Oh,
right? So, and that was the really interesting thing when I started doing the research was like, oh, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? So, yeah.
so even I'm saying in that context, would you say that blaxploitation wasn't always reserved to just the cinema, that it was also being put in print?
Oh, yeah, no, it was definitely being put in print, and I touch upon that a little bit in the book, in the Death of Bobby Hart. I don't go into it too much, but it really is this once you figure out the same thing happened with hip hop, right?
Mhm.
And so like blaxploitation and then black experience novels and hip hop and you could go backwards, you could go to the race movies of the 30s and 20s, 30s and 40s. It's all the same thing, right? It's
Yeah.
all, they will always say, black doesn't sell that well, or black only sells to black folks.
Hmm.
Um, and then the moment they start making money off of it,
Oh yeah.
right? They're like, oh, we got to chase that dollar, right?
Right.
But they also tend to try to control it more, try to control that image of who we are, what we are, and um, you see it a lot in music, especially because if you don't stay within a certain type of music,
Hmm.
suddenly they don't know what to do with you, right? And the same thing will happen in literature or in comics or film, but it's always interesting trying to decipher, like, okay, were these writers really doing what they telling the stories they wanted to tell,
Hmm.
or were they stuck telling these stories, you know?
Mm. Now, what would you say as far as like how this book is constructed, as far as either the death of Bobby Hart in this story, or better yet, even the true life of events of the death of Donald Goines? Did that start almost a downward spiral into what they called street literature?
Yeah, I mean, it's and I touch upon this in the book too, because there's a couple interviews I've read over the years of people who work for Holloway House. I believe Odie Hawkins was one, Emery, I can't remember his last name, but they were some of the black employees who worked for Holloway House,
Okay.
writers, editors, and they were all talking about how Bentley Morris, who was the owner of the company, one of the owners of the company, who was a white dude, had this very narrow idea of what black was,
Mm-hmm.
and that's all you're going to get. And you can even look, you can see it in Players Magazine, right? Like
Hmm.
there was a type of woman that he felt these are the only naked black women,
I could throw
people
in the
want to
book.
see. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I tried to get some of that into the story without it being heavy-handed. Um, and it went through a lot of changes as I was writing it. And but ultimately what I wanted to do, and I talk about this openly, right? So I did a 6-page short for an anthology a few years back,
Okay.
and that was we'll go back even further. I started writing a screenplay based on Donald Goines, and it just fell apart, and I didn't do anything with it. I got invited to be part of this comic book anthology on noir and crime stories, and I was like, yo, I wonder if I could take that story that I was trying to turn into a screenplay, condense it into 6 pages,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, that's a challenge. So I did it. I was very happy with it, happy with the anthology, but I was like, yeah, I want to tell more of this story. And so I decided to dust off this Bobby Hart idea, and and then it began to really start to take shape because I was like, I'm not going to tell the Donald Goines story. I'm going to tell the Bobby Hart story.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to get to know him as a character. I started to think about him as a real person, and down to so that the short story that originally appeared in this anthology called Noir is the New Black, like it's a 6-page story about a writer named Bobby Hart who
Mm-hmm.
gets murdered, right? And like that story is so different than what this new story is. The
Mm-hmm.
killer is different, the motivation is different. Like I had to change all of it because why the hell am I going to do the same thing I've already done before? Let's explore it. And that was where um at one point I realized, yo, I'm kind of part of this is about my life and my career right now. Where I like the position that I'm in, how people view me, how editors and publishers treat me, and and Bobby took on a different life for me. He was a really I get when I'm writing a character, I like to get to know them. I like to try to flesh them out. And he was like him and his wife Ruby, who you know, she's also gets murdered in this story.
Yeah.
And then at some point I made this crazy decision, which was like, oh, the first page is going to be them dead. Like we're going to unpack this thing. We're going to show them the scene of the crime, and then we're going to start moving through time in a non-linear way. And it's the story is going to be him writing what will ultimately be his last book and setting up the stage for his murder. So we'll see, the Kickstarter is over in a few days, and
Yeah.
with a little luck, the book will be out. It's done.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a question of setting up the printing and all that sort of stuff. We're finalizing some of the color stuff. I did a test run last week, printed up some pages, and I was like, oh, nope, we got to go back to the drawing board with some of these colors. They're not gonna print well on the paper that we're gonna be using. So
Yep.
but it's ready to go, man, and I'm ready for people to see this thing. So
Absolutely. I'm actually behind this computer, kicking myself because I have Noir is the New Black by Fair Square,
yeah.
Fair Square right up here on my shelf, and I didn't put two and two together. I'm
Yeah,
upset
no,
at that.
it's all right. It's all right. I mean, it was interesting because Fair Square, Fabrice, who's the publisher at Fair Square, he was the one who really put it in my head, like, yo, you should do a longer version of this story. And
Mm,
I was like, okay, I know I could do it, then it started getting down to like how many pages will this be, and who's interested in publishing it. And as I was talking to some publishers, they were kind of, you can just sort of tell when they're like, I don't know, I've never heard of who's Donald Goines. What's this
Oh
book about?
man.
It's about a junkie. It's about a and because I'm not Ed Brubaker, right? Like I
Mhm.
don't get to do those sort of things. And I love what Ed Brubaker does. I'm a big fan of his. Um, and so I decided like, okay, I'm gonna put this book. I'm probably gonna have to put this book out myself. If I have to put this book out myself, it means I'm gonna have to keep it shorter than I might want it to be. So it's got to be under 80 pages. I knew that. And then
Right.
I started working the story and I was like, oh, I think I can get it in. It's like 60. And I was looking at like other like graphic novels from the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. Like
Mhm.
the one that stands out the most is one called Detectives Inc., which was Don McGregor and Marshall Rogers, which is like was groundbreaking when it came out and it kind of blew my mind. I'm like a kid reading this thing.
Mhm.
And I was like, okay, I can do this. So I put these limitations of length on what this book was going to be, knowing I could always add like process pages and do an essay about Donald Goines, but like the book itself is going to have to be under 80. And then I started talking to publishers and they were all like, well, we want 120 or we want 150. And I was like, are you going to pay for 120? Are
Right.
you going to pay for 150? And if you are, what's your marketing plan? Tell me now, because if you put this book out and it doesn't do well, you're going to hold that against me. Like that's just how these publishers work. I've been down this path before, and I was like, but I can put this out myself. I can raise the money myself to print a certain number of copies, and then if I need more, I can print more. But like, let's go to the people. Let's just do that. It's like Too Short selling selling his mixtapes out of the trunk of his car in Oakland.
Yeah. I feel like that's the only way. And there was actually, I actually like how in the beginning of the book, through the like the first 11 pages that you sent to me, there was the conceptualization of the type of audience that Bobby Hart's books brought
Yeah,
out. Because you have the black detective and you have the white detective. The black detective don't even know who this man is, but the white detective knows exactly who this man is and knows
yeah.
his books in detail.
And we get more into that as the story progresses. And those two characters actually are inspired by two characters that were in some of Donald Goines' books. Donald Goines' last four books were Crime Partners, Deathless, Kenyatta's Escape, and Kenyatta's Last Hit. They were sort of a
Mhm.
quadrilogy, and there was these two detectives. There was I can't remember their names, but one was white, one was black. They had this sort of adversarial relationship, and if you ever see the movie Detroit 9000, um, which is a Blaxploitation movie from the 70s. I believe that those two characters in Detroit 9000, the two detectives in that, were inspired by the detectives in Goines's books. And so I just was like, the obvious thing would be to have the black detective know who Bobby Hart is and know
Right.
everything about him. And I was like, if that's the obvious choice, let's go the opposite direction. Um, and so we learn, that Frank Dennison is a fan of like he says I've read some of the books,
Hmm.
and then as it progresses, he's like, yo, I thought Confessions of a Junkie was like a great book.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that was really fun playing with those expectations too.
Yeah, and it almost of course brings out the translation in the popular culture because you have a lot of hip hop artists that be like, 70% of my audience is white.
Yeah, yeah. And also like the um a lot of the historians and a lot of the critics who are writing about this stuff, who are keeping it alive in one capacity or another, they're white folks, and I can't get mad about that. I wish there was more black folks out there that were like well versed in the stuff and taking the time, whether it's to do a podcast or to do like little video essays or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, again, everyone's talking about Sinners, right? Which, by the way, I love that movie. Um,
Absolutely.
and all these people are like, yo, it's the best black vampire movie of all time. And then all these other people are going, oh no, it's Blade. Blade is the greatest black
Hmm.
vampire movie of all time. And then I'm like, none of you are mentioning Ganja and Hess.
Mm-hmm.
and none of you are mentioning Blackula,
Blackula.
which the fact that you're not mentioning those, or those that are mentioning Blackula are mentioning it in a more dismissive, way, I'm like, y'all have lost all credibility with me.
Yeah.
And so when I say Ganja and Hess, most people are like, well, what's that? And I'm like, that's Bill Gunn's movie. They're like, who's Bill Gunn? And I'm
Oh,
like, okay, so right, do I need to
right.
educate you right now? Right? Do I need to show you not just Ganja and Hess, but um Hal Ashby's movie, The Landlord,
Mm-hmm.
which Bill Gunn wrote, and get into who he was as a actor, a playwright, a director,
Right.
a queer black man, and just go like, y'all don't know who this is, right? But yet you're arguing over which is better, Sinners or Blade, which Sinners is a better movie.
Of course.
Let's get down to it,
I mean,
right?
if we got to take it even further, I was a kid and I watched Grace Jones's Vamp,
Yes. No
and it's
one's
like
talking about that one either. No.
nobody talks about that. And that one is like top three, and it ain't three.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's it, man. I mean, it's interesting when people compare stuff, and it's like great, but like dig a little deeper. You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? Like even when I talk about, because I'll talk about Iceberg Slim and Donald Goines, um, I seldom bring up Chester Himes, but it's like Chester Himes came before Iceberg Slim,
Iceberg
right?
Slim.
And and it's interesting because Chester Himes, I'm not gonna say he's a better writer than those two. Um, I would say a more diverse body of work,
Mm-hmm.
and most of his stuff is out of print in the US, you know.
Ah,
And it's like, but when I think of like the king of black pulp fiction, I think Chester Himes. I think of his Harlem detective books, Cotton Comes to Harlem, All Shot Up, all that sort of stuff. For Love of Imabel. And when I start talking about this stuff, and most people look at me like, well, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, like I'm not going to explain it to you. Take your ass to the computer.
mhm.
Better yet, go to the library because they'll probably be able to help you more at the library.
Something interesting in what you just said. I'm wondering if any of Goins's or better yet, Iceberg Slim's books uh actually did well outside of the United States, outside of domestically, and just basically traveled overseas.
I'm pretty sure Pimp did. I think Pimp did really well. Donald Goines stuff, I'm not sure about. Now, here's something interesting I'm going to throw at you though. Did
Okay.
you know that Daddy Cool was adapted into a graphic novel?
No.
Yes, and it's hard as hell to find. It was like 1980, early 80s, 83, 84. And it was a white writer named Don Glut, I believe, and a Filipino artist, Alfredo Alcala, which if people are hardcore comic book fans, they're going to know
Yeah.
Alfredo Alcala because he did a lot of Conan the Barbarian stuff. And so they did this graphic novel of Daddy Cool, which again, if you dig around, you can find it. I've been trying to find someone who'd be willing to publish a remastered version of it, but I don't know where any of the art is, right? And
I,
it's this beautiful black and white book, and it's Alfredo Alcala, who is just like
mhm.
one of the dopest artists of his generation. Um, but yeah, with Donald Goines, I don't think anybody made I don't think he made the transition overseas the way Chester Himes did. Chester Himes was huge, especially in France.
Mhm.
Um, and and Iceberg Slim, I think, with the exception of Pimp, Pimp is the only one of his books that really like went somewhere and really did something outside of the U.S. At least I think. I could be wrong, man. I'm shit. I'm wrong most of the time. So.
All right. How do you think how did the 1970s define black culture to you?
That's a great question. That answer has shifted a lot over the years,
Hmm.
because what I realize is that like what we saw in the 70s was just a new version of what had happened, like I'll say like starting in the late 30s into the 40s with the black cast films, the race films. But more than anything, what the 70s was the beginning of black creatives in film and in literature to a certain extent, or this type of literature, taking more control. And so there was
Hmm.
more voices that were, not all the blaxploitation movies were made by black directors, but Van Peebles did Sweet Sweetback, and
Hmm.
Gordon Parks did Shaft, and Ossie Davis did, not just Cotton Comes to Harlem, but he did Gordon's War, which is a very underrated movie. He did Countdown at Cucini, which is like not underrated at all. It's not a particularly good movie, but Bill Crane directed Blackula. And so it was the beginning of like where we're at now, going back to say Sinners or going back to Jordan Peele's movies.
Hmm.
Um, any black filmmaker right now making movies, Regina King and the movie she's making, Ava DuVernay, the movie she's making, everybody, like like the seeds, some of the seeds from which their careers and their movies came were really planted in the 70s. I mean, there's some of those going back even further, right? You go
Yeah.
to Oscar Micheaux and folks like that. But the thought of black folks making movies for largely a black audience, but those some of those movies finding success outside of that, what they call the inner city market. Back then it was called the inner city urban market. It doesn't quite exist the way that it used to. But you know, Superfly, Shaft, Sweetback, those three films in particular jumped out of that urban ghetto that the
Yeah.
distributors put them in, and found success in ways that, you know, most films that are meant for black audiences had never had, or seldom had.
Hmm.
And now we see it more often, right? Like, especially with someone like Coogler or Jordan Peele, you look at their movies and the amount of money they make,
Hmm.
that's white people going to see the movies money. You know
Oh
what I'm
yeah,
saying? Like,
exactly.
and so but I think the 70s really was like, there was a it was like the urban revenge fantasy, the hypersexualized black man, the sexualized black woman, all that sort of stuff was normalized then. Now, I'm not saying that that was a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying it was
Yeah.
normalized, right? Um, and it went mainstream. That was the key thing, you know. You could look at a movie like Mandingo, which came out in 75,
Hmm.
but most people don't realize that it was a book that came out in 57,
Mm.
and then that book spawned something like 15 other books, right?
Hmm.
So all this stuff was around, um, but a lot of it was like relegated to, dark alleyways and whatnot. And um, suddenly it was like, oh no, okay, yeah, oh gee, what are all these black folks watching? What is Foxy Brown all about?
Yeah.
And it's like, and then white America saw Pam Grier and they were like, oh my God,
Hmm. Which is more than likely those gentlemen that were reading those players books when they saw Pam Grier on screen. It
Yeah,
was like I've been reading about her my whole life.
yeah, 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 yeah. Been dreaming about her my whole life
Dreaming
too.
about her my whole life. So all these directors and all these writers that you've
Mhm.
described, they're revolutionaries.
I believe so, yeah.
However you want to describe it. How would you say comics is a part of revolution?
Oh man, I wasn't expecting that question. I mean, part of the way comics is part of that revolution is that, comics are nowadays not so much, but they were everywhere for a very long time,
Yeah.
right? Um, in the olden days, like when I was a kid, you go to the grocery store and they had a rack for comics. 7-Eleven, you go to a gas station, you can buy comics just about anywhere, right?
Yeah.
And nowadays, you know, you'll read about a comic selling, tens of thousands of units, maybe even 100,000 units. So, a Batman issue, maybe hitting close to 500,000. But like the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, comic books were a single issue of a comic would sell several million copies, right?
Hmm.
And and what was, I think, revolutionary about them was they were really affordable, and especially for, like, you know I'll say income challenged people,
Yeah.
income challenged kids. My grandparents give me $1, and with $1 I could go to the store and buy like three or four comics, right?
Hmm.
I mean, I was buying comics when they were 25 cents each.
Right.
Um and and you're getting exposed to ideas and concepts. I'm getting exposed to storytelling and structure. But for that, 25 cents, 35 cents in which I bought a comic, Well, my cousin bought this other comic over here for 35 cents. So he reads his, I read mine, then we trade them off, you know,
Mhm.
and then we go to the kids down the street and we trade them, and these ideas are spreading, right? And um and if you're lucky, you might stumble across a comic that inspires you in a certain way. I mean, I think that Marvel's X-Men, especially in the late 70s into the early 80s, is a prime example of that, right?
Yeah.
Like that few comics, I was just talking about this the other day, few comics have had the impact the way the X-Men had, specifically like during Chris Claremont and John Byrne's run, which is from about 77 to about 81 or so.
Hmm.
And when you look at that, and it's like I mean, X-Men fans are the most rabid people I've ever met, you know. Um, but it was like there are so many people I know, people of color, queer people, non-binary people who, neurodivergent people who like X-Men made them feel like they had a place somewhere.
Yeah.
And like I'll go to the grave fighting for that,
Yeah.
right? And I think that, comics, if you study the history of comics, it was a medium that was, most of the early comic book artists and writers were Jewish writers who could not get work because of anti-Semitism in the 30s, right?
Okay.
So they kind of founded this own little industry. Most of the early comic book artists were Jewish writers, same thing, and this continued into the 50s and 60s. So um, Jack Kirby, his real name is Jacob Kurtzberg. Stan Lee, his real name is Stanley Lieber. Will Eisner, Siegel and Schuster, Bob Kane. I can't remember Bob Kane. I don't think that's his real name, if I remember correctly.
Hmm.
But so it was an industry built largely by outsiders and people who were sort of frowned upon by the upper echelons, and
Yeah.
they create this medium in this industry that's also frowned upon. And the ease of entry, look, it's hard making comics, but it's kind of easier to make comics than it is to make a movie. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And 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 by the 60s, even before the 60s, you look at the 40s, there's like all Negro comics, and there were creators out there that was doing stuff. And if you look through the old black owned newspapers, the Chicago Defender, the LA Sentinel, papers like that, they all had their syndicated comic strips. They had Speed Jackson, they had Bumbleton Green. So there's a history of black comics that a lot of people don't even know about, but it's
Hmm.
there, right? And all of that stuff, anything that sparks your imagination, anything that inspires you and maybe even makes you go, I want to do this, it's revolutionary, you know. And I think about that all the time. I when I talk to my students, I talk about that. I'm like, you know, it's not, you shouldn't just be looking to make comics. You should be looking to make change. You should be looking to get, not just young people, but older people off their asses and go, like, I want to do this, you know. Um, and so to me, it's one of the reasons why I do self-publish stuff. It's one that, I don't need to,
Yeah.
I choose to, right? I'm like one of the luckiest people in comics, you know? I mean, Bitterroot is doing well, and we've got a good publisher, and they support us, and there's a lot of ideas, including Bobby Hart, that I could have taken to a publisher, which I did,
Hmm.
but I wasn't willing to do the things that they wanted in order for me to tell my story, or to better get to tell Bobby's story, because it's really his story.
Great answer. Great answer. But perfect segue
Yeah.
because you talked about Bitterroot, and I'd be remiss if I didn't have this book behind me and I didn't say a thing about it. Now we're in this jump.
Yeah.
Of course, it's about I'm going to say what a good 30 years now.
Yeah, the very end of Bitterroot number 15 ends in like 1938, 39.
Yeah. So
With
now
a
we're
with an epilogue, just a short little epilogue,
mhm,
and now we're in 1964.
1964.
Yeah.
So what? First off, what made the gang get back together?
We were stupid, I think.
Oh man.
it was like this is actually the story that's coming out now. We were trying to get it out in 2023. We were trying to get it out nearly
Okay.
2 years ago, but like getting our act together, getting us to come together. But I just was, more, we all sort of knew there's more to be done.
Mhm.
And I was actually having a conversation with Rodney Barnes, of all people, who's a friend of mine. Rodney does Philadelphia and other
Yeah.
things. And Rodney was like, "Oh man, it's not fair that you guys have only put out 15 comics
Yeah.
and 16 if you count the Red Summer special. Um, you've only put out 16 comics and you're still kind of like everybody's talking about you, like the conversation hasn't changed."
Hmm.
And I was like, yeah, that's true. Because Philadelphia is a dope book. I mean, like
Absolutely.
Philadelphia should have pushed Bitterroot out of the way at this
Hmm.
point because they've been going consistently. And that got me to thinking about, most people would kill to be in our position. We shouldn't be taking this for granted. And so
Yeah.
I went to Chuck and Sanford and I said, look, let's bring this back. And it was a struggle, in part because each of us has our own thing that's going on, right?
Yeah.
And I happen to be like, again, I'm really fortunate. I've worked for Marvel, I've worked for DC. I've scratched that itch for the most part.
Hmm.
Um, I don't if I just and I have a Marvel, a one shot coming out later this summer, it's fine. But if I never work for Marvel or DC again, I'd be cool with it, right? I really would be. Like, I love making my own stuff and I
Hmm.
love owning it. And it's like, okay, I can work for Marvel and I can have bragging rights, but when they make, you know, a movie or a TV show, I ain't getting any money from that,
Right.
and so that those bragging rights don't mean as much to me there as the bragging rights of saying, okay, yeah, maybe Bitterroot won't get made into a movie, right? Um, but I own Bitterroot. I
Mhm.
co-own it with these other two dudes. No one can tell us what we can and can't do other than ourselves. And and what I try to tell Chuck and Sanford is that, like, we're in a position that a very rare position where it's like we could bring in more people. We could open doors for more people, and we can look at other creators of color, women, all the people that suddenly are losing jobs because DEI is like a bad thing.
Right.
And I'm like, nah, it ain't a bad thing. Like, and I've said to them, and I've said this out loud many times. I look at like what Mike Mignola did with Hellboy,
Hmm.
and I was like, we should be doing that with Bitterroot. Like, we could turn this into a a a huge franchise, but only we can do it. And
Yeah.
we have to get out of our own way. And a lot of times, folks get in their own way. So
It's true. It's true. And it's funny because you brought up Sinners a couple times that people have referenced either Bitterroot and
yeah,
Philadelphia as sort of like an inspiration for that.
yeah. And the truth is, a lot of people don't realize this, that Bitterroot was over. Legendary had optioned it like back in 2017, something like that. I can't even remember when.
Hmm.
Um, and they signed Ryan Coogler and his company Proximity signed on to produce the Bitterroot movie, and then Regina King signed on to direct it. And
Mm.
so we've been working with those all three of those entities for a long time. Um, and then some things kind of derailed over at Legendary, and Coogler left the
Hmm.
project, and then Regina left the project, and then we were like, "Oh, wait, what just happened?" Like
Right.
we had caught lightning in a
Yeah. You,
bottle,
you
right?
had the dream team.
We had the dream team, and without getting into the specifics, it was like, um, then it came out that Ryan had this new movie he was doing, and it was Sinners, and a lot of people, and they're still doing it today. I'm getting texts and emails all since the movie dropped. Hey man, he ripped you off and da 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 da. And I'm like, no, he didn't rip off Bitterroot, right? He, I will say that there's inspiration from Bitterroot that
Right.
I can see in Sinners, but I can also say that, like, um that some of that inspiration is also the like everyone's talking about Sugar Shack, Ernie Barnes's painting from the Marvin Gaye album.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like you see Sugar Shack in Sinners. I see it. I saw that scene.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you know what to look for, you saw it in Bitter Root too, right? Like we're going to the same sources, right? Like a lot of us listen to Eric B. and Rakim, right? And
Yeah.
so, you come away from it and it's like if you're not being inspired and influenced by the books you read, the movies you watch, the music you listen to, and if some of that doesn't seep into your work, I'm gonna say, and this is a bold statement to make, that you're not as creative as you think you are,
Mm-hmm.
because it should be there should be moments where your audience is like, oh, where did he get that idea from? And the answer is, well, it's a combination of my own imagination, but hey, I read August Wilson's plays and I went and saw a couple of them, and that dynamic of family dysfunction,
Mm-hmm.
like that's all over Bitter Root, right?
Oh
You
yeah.
know, um, there's so much of that like how do you there's I remember the first time I listened to Eric B and Rakim, and I can't remember which song it is, but they sample the Art Blakey trio,
Okay.
or it's Art Blakey. I think it's Art Blakey trio, Art
What is it?
Blakey and
Don't
Jasmine.
sweat the technique.
I think so. It's like got that really great bass line,
Mm-hmm.
and
Doom,
like
doom,
I
doom,
never
doom, doom,
heard.
doom, doom,
Yep,
doom, 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 doom. That one.
yep, never heard of Art Blakey. One day, a friend of mine said, "Oh yeah, check this out." First track on the album, and I was like, "Oh, wait a minute,"
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing, that's the there's you draw inspiration, you build off of it, and then you just move forward, and that's what I see Sinners doing, and that's what I've tried to do with Bitter Root, and with the new arc that we're doing, which again takes place in 64, is like, yo, if you want to know what this arc is about, the two movies to watch are In the Heat of the Night
Mm-hmm.
and Night of the Living Dead,
Mm.
and that's it. That's it. This is In the Heat of the Night of the Living Dead. That's what this is meant to be, and with a little bit of Challengers of the Unknown thrown in, which most people are like, the
Oh
hell are the
wow.
Challengers of the Unknown? And it's like, go look, you
Right.
know.
Yep. Now, when we're talking about how this book behind me,
Mhm.
at 5 issue miniseries. Now, the Sangreye family, how they basically evolved over time, but still hunting the same demons.
Yeah.
Where, like, for one, the Genu, and how
Yeah.
how they've basically have started to evolve themselves
Yeah.
at the same rate that the Sangreye family has been able to evolve. How has this been building?
You know, I think it's just me and the team sort of venting our frustration with society as a whole, right?
Mm-hmm.
And um and just sort of like going, okay, well, what's the story we're trying to tell? And the story we're trying to tell is like, this is the life we live. This
Yeah.
is the life we're living. And if you don't understand it and you don't see it, um, you know, maybe we can help open your eyes, but I don't want to be heavy-handed, right? Again, you know, like I love In the Heat of the Night and Night of the Living Dead, two movies I absolutely love. And part of what I love about them is that they're good movies first before there's any sort of message in them,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you're
Yes.
not, and that's the same thing with you when I look at Sinners and I go, oh my God, I can't believe he's saying this.
Mm-hmm.
Where the person next to me is like, saying what? And it's like, this is all about assimilation. This is all about integration versus segregation. You don't get that? And
Mm-hmm.
they're like, well, what are you talking about? And it's like, okay, don't worry about it. Just
Don't worry
enjoy
about it.
the movie.
Yep.
Yeah.
And are we referencing the scene where the vampires are talking to them at the door?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That, now, also in that broad brush, um, at the end of the original run of Bitterroot, is it, and going into this,
Yeah.
is it detailed that, even if we destroy the villain, is there always somebody deeper and darker being seated in the wings, just waiting to arise? It's kind of like, yeah, if we get rid of Trump, there's probably somebody even worse
Yeah.
behind.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, there is that, and it's also about how things evolve. When George Floyd was killed back in, was it 2020?
Hmm.
Um, and there's the violence that erupted in a bunch of cities. And I was one of those people. Our book, The Black Panther Party, the is a nonfiction graphic novel I did with Marcus Kwame Anderson, hadn't come out yet.
Hmm.
It was about to be, it was going to be published early 2021. The day that all the violence erupted surrounding the murder of George Floyd was the day that I was writing the afterword for the Black Panther Party. It was a
Hmm.
completely different afterword. And then all of a sudden I saw what was going on in the news and I was like, yo, this was, we already knew this was going to happen. And I posted on social media. I was like, they like in 65, they knew this was going to happen.
Yeah.
The Kerner Commission wrote a report and said this is where this country is headed. And people are like, what's the Kerner Commission report? And I'm like, it was the commission after all the racial violence it was 65, I believe, 64, 65. And I was like, this is the conclusion that the commission came to. It said, this is what's going to happen.
Right.
I'm looking at it on the news. And most people are like, I've never heard of the Kerner Commission. And I'm like, well, therein lies the problem, right?
But
Because
was that after the assassination of Martin Luther King, after the race riots had basically like simmered down? That was the commission that took place
it was before that,
for
and
that.
I get confused if it was because the Watts uprising was 65, if
Hmm.
I remember correctly, and then in 67, 1967 was the long hot summer. There was a bunch of uprisings and a lot of violence in 67.
Yeah.
I want to say the Kerner Commission was between Watts and the summer of 67, um, and it was basically this, and it was led by primarily conservatives, and they all came to the same conclusion that this country is evolving into two vastly different nations. Nation, black nation, white nation, nation of haves and have-nots, and that if we didn't do something about it now, because this is as they're fighting for desegregation, if we don't do something about it now and do more than just the like sort of cosmetic changes,
Hmm.
like we're going to have all these problems later on. And now we're having and we've been having those problems, right?
Yes.
And I just wanted to get into, I want a bit of root in the 60s to sort of play around with some of that, to play around with like, um, the as difficult as the 60s were, like at least they weren't hiding how they felt.
Exactly.
It was like
It wasn't
they
as covert as
Yeah,
it is now.
it was just straight up. We don't want you. We don't want you going to our schools. We don't want you. And now those young people that were protesting, the Little Rock Nine or Ruby Bridges or people like that throwing rocks, and
Hmm.
the people that were trying to kill us and did kill a lot of us, like their children are now, running things.
Yeah.
Their grandchildren are like that legacy has been passed on, and part of it has been passed on because of how history is taught and recorded, and that's what a lot of this new Bitterroot arc is about. It's about
Mm.
like how do you concoct a lie that's so big that people will believe it, you know?
Yeah, it's like a hidden indoctrination.
Yep.
I did it. I ain't just
Yeah.
gonna tell you how I did it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Sir, I appreciate you doing this with me. This fabulous talk.
Yeah.
I do. I appreciate it 100%. What is it? We got like what, 6, 7 days of Death of Bobby Hart?
I want to say it ends on Saturday. Saturday or Sunday is when the
Okay.
campaign ends. And so, we've hit our goal. It'd be nice to hit some more because there's another project that I'm trying to get money to. My philosophy is if I'm going to self-publish it before I go to Kickstarter, I want to make sure I paid for all of the art. And that's where things get difficult, right? So,
Yep.
there's another project that I'm in the middle of that, like, yeah, it'd be nice to get some more money on Kickstarter because then I don't have to go into my own pocket directly to pay the artist. So we'll see what happens.
Correct. And the creative team, Dietrich Smith, Craig Johnson, Chris Sotomayor, Kane and White did the cover, which is
Yeah,
fabulous, by the way.
yeah.
Excellent team.
Yeah, and Craig did the Dietrich is the main artist. Craig does the spot illustrations for the chapters that are the book that Bobby's writing.
Hmm.
And but he's also done these three like bonus images that are covers to Bobby Hart books. So there's he just sent me Pimp Wars this morning. So I'm
Mm.
going to be sharing that tomorrow. But he did a cover for Pimp Wars, for the sequel to Pimp Wars, which is Slaughter on the Stroll, and then for the first Ghetto Avenger book, which is, Bobby Hart's most popular book is the Ghetto Avenger trilogy.
Excellent, sir. Once again, I appreciate you doing this with me. This is a fabulous talk. Hopefully, we get a chance to do this again.
Yeah, thank you very much. When let me know when this is up. I will share it and we'll just go from there. And then after it comes out, and then you can read the whole thing, and then you'll be like, "Oh shit, I wasn't expecting this."
Yeah,
Hopefully, that's what'll happen. So,
for sure. So, for everybody here at the Facts Project, David F. Walker, myself, Grandmaster Facts, and we will see you guys next time. We are out.